In this Clip Studio Paints tutorial, we're going to talk about transparent materials. We'll go over how light behaves and go over some of the physics. Alright, I'm out of here. Wait. Then we'll go over how to paint transparent forms, move from there into some studies, and end off with a painting demo. Okay, let's get started. Now normally when I think of transparent objects, I think about things like glass, plastic, or water. And to understand how to paint these objects, we have to dig deeper to understand what's really going on with the light. You can probably guess objects are transparent because light goes through them. What happens is a process called refraction. So when light moves from one object to another, it changes direction according to Snell's law. Now this is primarily a digital painting video, not a physics or CG one, so the main thing to know is that different materials have different indexes of refraction, which is basically a rating on how fast light moves through that material. To help you understand why the light changes direction when moving from one object with an index of refraction to another with a different index of refraction, there's a simple analogy that my high school physics teacher used to give. So imagine this packet of light or photon was a little car. Autopilot, just driving straight. It moves from the paved road to maybe something harder to move in like sand. So the side of the wheel hits the sand first and it starts to slow down. The wheels on the other side of the road, however, are still moving fast. This side slow, this side fast. You can imagine that it starts to turn. Okay, so here's a classic example of refraction. Put a pencil in water, bam. Light goes through, very obvious refraction. Now let's take a look at this picture I took at a local military museum. We know there's glass between us. You can most likely tell not because of the refraction, but because you can see some reflections. So reflection is a lot easier for everyone to understand. It's light just bouncing off of a surface. Very easy principle. The angle of the light coming in, or the angle of incidence, is the same as the angle that's coming out, the angle of reflection. What might not be that common to know is that these angles refer to the ones normal to the surface. So this angle here is the angle of incidence, and this one's the angle of reflection. Going back to this picture, we can see that light is reflected and refracted. We can see the reflection and we can see through the glass to the object. And this is true of all transparent objects. I talked about them separately to break it down, but both happen simultaneously. Some of the light goes through and gets refracted, and some of it just reflects off. Okay, so let's build up our skills with this knowledge. So I'll demonstrate how to turn a regular sphere into a transparent one, like a glass ball. Here's the regular sphere just painted in with the highlight, a core shadow, cast shadow, and some reflected light. Okay, now I'm working on the transparent sphere, so I'm just going to copy that sphere over. Obviously, I'm going to need to erase out the center so we can actually see through it. But first, I'm going to work on just an outer edge and just darkening an outer edge because the glass is going to be thicker here. So I'm using a gradient tool for that and just erasing it out. And now I'm adding reflections. Not the highlight, but just some light values around the edges as well. Obviously, I'm going to need to add in the highlight again. And now finally, I'm erasing out the center of the sphere. So this still doesn't look right because with refraction, it should distort the light going through, right? So here I'm just copying that selection of my background onto a new layer using a circular selection and just copy paste. And now I'll distort it with the fingertip tool. And there we go, a very simple refraction effect. Okay, lastly, for transparent objects, sometimes we actually get light in the shadow here, in the cast shadow. And what's happening is the material is acting like a lens. It's focusing the light rays onto this one spot, like an evil kid with a magnifying glass, terrorizing ants. This is what's called a caustic effect. This looks good, but sometimes you can also see refraction entirely flip the image upside down when you're looking through this glass ball. And so thankfully we can do that as well. We have that section on a separate layer. We can just quickly Control T to transform and rotate it. Okay, so why does it go upside down? Again, like I said, this is just also refraction that causes the image to be reversed. So imagine light bouncing off from the top of this tree it goes through our glass ball and it gets refracted. Then when it comes back out, it is refracted again and goes to our eye. So that light from the top of the tree ended up on the bottom of this glass sphere. On the other hand, looking at light coming in and bouncing off the bottom of the tree, it goes through the glass ball, refracts, and goes to the top of the glass ball before coming to our eye. So you can see how refraction here can sometimes make images reverse. Okay, so let's break this image up. So I have one layer, which is just the basic sphere, and I erased out the center part because we're going to be able to see through. And then here is a dark layer just for the edges, around the edges where the glass is thicker. And finally, this light value reflection, also around the edges. Now, why this reflection? We know that the highlight on the sphere is supposed to be here, a direct reflection of the light source. Not all around the sphere. So where is this part coming from? Okay, one last trip to physics. Remember how I said both reflection and refraction occur? Well, how much of the light is refracted and how much of it is reflected? This is where things can get a little bit more complicated with Fresnel equations. You're losing me here. To bring it back to art, essentially what we can take from this is that light reflects more when it comes in from a larger angle of incidence, and it refracts more when it comes in from a lower angle of incidence. Take a look at this photo I took while on a walk. It's not the best example, but you can see the point. You can see here at point A, we can see through the surface of the water. You can see that green mossy area underneath the water. There's less reflections here compared to point B. There's super clear reflections of those houses, almost a mirror-like quality. Okay, let's take a look at what's going on. So, if we're looking at this from the side, here's a side view of the lake and me and my camera. So at point A, there's light coming in into our camera, reflecting off the surface, and we know the angle of incidence because it's the same as the angle of reflection. And same thing at point B. So there's still going to be light transmitted, but I'm only drawing the reflected rays, right? So the angle of incidence at A is a lot smaller compared to B. And based on what we just learned, that means that at B, more of the light is being reflected compared to A. There's less of the light being reflected, more transmission. So that's why we see more reflections at point B. And we can see through the water at A. And this is the exact same thing that happens for the sphere. Near the edges, this is how the light comes into our eyes. It came in from a very large angle of incidence. It might be easier to think that it came in just grazing the object. So because of that, there's more reflections here. I hope this shows how having a deeper understanding, in this case, in the science behind the light, can help you even more of your art, can help you take your art to the next level. Knowing about things like Fresnel reflections, we can connect something as foundational as being able to paint a glass ball, a transparent glass ball, and see how that connects and helps us paint something a lot more complicated, like reflections in a lake. Okay, let's move on to some studies and some cool features. So one good exercise to do to understand lighting is to draw a sphere in an environment. And let's do that with this environment and make that sphere transparent. We can select a circular area. We can go into Distort Fisheye. And here we can change the effect of the strength. Now, how cool is that? It kind of bulges out of the picture. Okay, and to really easily turn this into a glass ball, let's just do the same thing we did before to render the glass ball. I'll make an area and darken the edges. And by the way, a really smooth way you can do this to get a really smooth gradation is to just combine the lasso and gradient tools. You can see here it makes a very evenly shaded edge. Gradient tool set to the circular mode. Now you can add in a cast shadow, and let's brighten up the edges because of those Fresnel reflections. And add in a caustic effect to the cast shadow, and boom, we're done very quickly. When am I ever going to use this? Well, I don't think you'll get a job putting crystal balls into pictures, but you can keep this in mind for your own artwork if you ever need that fisheye lens effect. And again, it's just good practice for lighting. Okay, so I'm not going to be just showing you a bunch of spheres for the entire video. Let's move on. These are a bunch of photo reference studies that I tried to get the main idea of quickly in around 20 to 30 minutes. I always recommend studying from photos or other artists just to see how they simplify something, like painting water. So a lot of these are going to be water studies. And a common thing you can do for the reflections in the water is, simply select the top half and just copy and paste it on another layer. And you can just transform it, edit transform or Control T and flip it vertically. And now just know that reflections are always darker. That's the rule, which should make sense again, because if we go back to our model of how the light works, some of the light is going to be reflected, other parts of the light are going to be refracted, and they're just not going to make it back into our eyes. Whatever it is, the reflection's never going to be as high value as the real object, so we can just darken it slightly. To test yourself to see if you really understand how to paint transparent objects, you can try doing a longer study. So here's a picture of a broken transparent teapot that I took. And because I have an understanding of the refraction here, the caustic effects, and the reflections, I know what to look out for and how to paint this. And this one took a lot longer. I'm kind of sad how long it took, actually, for such a boring subject. But at least it turned out alright. And if you ask me about my layers here, it's definitely not as neat as the sphere examples. I wouldn't be able to explain to you each and every layer and why I made those choices now. It's a lot of just fine adjusting in the reflections, in the refraction, and the tiny details and imperfections on the teapot. And notice how messy and loose the background is, and that's okay. I just wanted to focus in on, studying the transparent object, the teapot. So that was my focus. Okay, let's end off the video with a painting demo. Okay, so for something more creative like this, I usually start with some quick composition studies to try to find an interesting creative idea in just black and white, something visually interesting. And I ended up debating in this case between a water scene or a very high glass building scene, because the same effect would apply here with the FRESNEL reflections. More reflective the further away we are, higher up in the building. But I like this idea of a girl, dipping her feet in water, so we went with that. So at the start, just blocking in some big shapes, just following that composition study. Now it's just going to be in color rather than black and white. But it's good to do the black and white step first, just because if things look good in black and white, then they should look good in color. As long as you don't go crazy with the color. So I like to use the magic wand tool and the lasso tool just to give me some quick selections, and the lasso tool to give me some very sharp edges, combining that with my brushes. So I just blocked in a whole image, not deviating too far from the composition. I just have to think about color now because I have it in black and white. And I like to keep things on one layer, but you'll see that it kind of explode later on. My goal is to keep things more on one layer. Layers are good, for the fine adjustments, but you also want to be more confident, and you can do that by keeping your layers to a minimum, just like painting in real life or traditionally. Alright, and at the end of the painting, I'll focus on some of the important areas that relate to what we learned about. I tried to include most of the things we talked about: caustic effects, transparency, FRESNEL reflections, with this water here. So I want that to be a focal point. So here I'm actually drawing in the fish, which I do want to be the focal point. It's just something interesting. It wasn't in the composition, but I felt like it would be a good addition. You know, the diagonal from the trees to the leg, just pointing down to this fish. And it also shows, you know, the transmission, or like the refraction at the foreground, and I'll draw in a little bit of reflections of the beach side in the back. You can see I don't zoom in much while I'm painting as well. I will later on, but at the start, you know, you don't want to get focused too much on one tiny corner of the painting. Now working on the trees, I like to jump around and not focus on one part. I think I used a blending mode overlay to give that kind of glow to the trees. Okay, so here actually, those little squiggly lines, I'm trying out an effect. Remember those caustic effects I told you about? With glass pots, glass containers, or anything glass really. Well, water waves can do that too. You can kind of see caustic effects generated by the waves. Mostly in shallow water, it wouldn't be right to paint those deep under the sea. But here it's on the surface, so I'm kind of implying some caustic effects. Okay, now on the shoreline, I'm adding in indications of some waves. Oh, and there's the reflection. Yep, right there. I'm making it darker than the actual, you know, beach area, because the reflections are always darker. Okay, and again, it's just always constant adjustments. So I thought, you know, those are too dark in the background, the indications of people. So I lighten them up a bit, and you can squint your eyes to see, you know, what should I work on next, what should include more detail, and what should, you know, be brought back a little bit, simplified. Okay, finally I'm adding in some indications of light. I mean, I should have done this a lot earlier. It just felt kind of stale, the image. So I did that on a layer. I think it's color dodge, the blending mode. And now I'm just redesigning the character, fixing some of the anatomy. I should have also focused on her a lot earlier, but good thing she's on a separate folder. So what I like about this image, or at least the idea, is all the diagonals, like her leg and the trees. Most things are very diagonal, unlike the beach line in the back, except for the hair, which I wanted to keep, you know, straight down as kind of contrasting. And if you're curious about the brushes I'm using, a lot of them I made myself, and I'm not like an expert brush maker, but Clip Studio Paint has a pretty good brush creation method tool. But you could also download some from the asset store. So I use a few brushes from the asset store too, and some default brushes like the gradient tool and the soft airbrush. Okay, so I wanted those fish to be the focal point, so I thought they were a little bit desaturated, so I increased the saturation there. So again, it's always, you know, what do you want to read first in your painting? What do you want the viewer to focus on? And for me, it's the foreground, those fish. Oh, here's something interesting I'm trying. So those caustic effects I told you about, they can also appear rainbow, so it's like chromatic aberration. The wave actually splits the light into, you know, kind of like a rainbow pattern. And honestly, to achieve that, I looked up another Clip Studio Paint tips article. I'll link that in the description. So I think we're almost done here. Yep, and there we go. So let's focus on some areas that are related to transparency and what we learned. Okay, so the first area, the focal point, this is where the fish are. And you can see a few effects here. The first one is that caustic effect. Here, it kind of becomes a rainbow shape, a rainbow pattern. And again, I followed a tips article on how to do that easier. The other one is that the fish pop out of the water. So in those areas, it's a lot more saturated, the color, compared to when we see through the water. That transparent underneath the surface of the water is a lot desaturated and darker value. Okay, and right behind the character we see some rocks, and we see some reflections from those rocks underneath the waves. But they're a little bit exaggerated. If it was a wavy day, then we wouldn't really see those clear reflections. So I'd probably redo that if I were to do this painting again. But here's the FRESNEL effect on a flat plane of water. So in the foreground, we saw through the water to the fish, and here we see the reflections. They dominate more because it's further back. And lastly, this is very zoomed in now, but you can see, I just wanted to mention the far beach. Originally I had some reflections there, but you can't really see that anymore because there's so many painted on layers and effects that kind of covered it up. And that's okay. You don't have to follow, the theory exactly. You are painting. You're not, making a realistic photoreal image. So I also wanted to point out that, from those photo studies, I realized, water can actually have a lot of different colors. So here it's a lot more purpley in the background. And that's why photo studies are good to do. Because otherwise you might just default to thinking, well, water is blue, right? Because you always associate with just the local color of the object, when really color is a lot more about the light. Okay, thanks for watching. So again, this video was for Clip Studio Paint's Tips of the Month on transparent art. So I hope you learned something about painting transparent objects, glass, water, or just some general painting advice. Be sure to check out the tips website for a bunch of user-submitted articles. A lot of them are very helpful, so it's a great resource. Thanks for watching. Bye.